Hello friends! Welcome back to How the Light Gets In. It's nice to see you again. Big shock. We're going to start with a story because there's this thing that my brain does. And I mean, your brain probably does it too, but I don't live there, so I can't really tell you what goes on. So they're called automatic thoughts. And it's like the things that just pop into your head, and if you're in a good place, you can recognize that they're irrational and do something with them. And if you're in a bad place, you can't help but kind of like indulge them and really just take the ride of your own crazy until you get to a point where you're like, dear God, what have I done? So for me, one of my biggest automatic thoughts, and one of the ones that I struggle with the most, is that if I hear sirens, I assume that someone that I know and love is dead. You don't know this because you're not in my office right now, but 2 blocks north of me is a fire station. There are a lot of sirens in my day. And so some days I'm able to just kind of like compartmentalize that up, ignore it, move on with my life. And some days I have this like moment of panic where I just know that my phone's about to ring and I'm going to hear like the worst news. And then I'm going to have to deal with the fallout of that. I'm guessing, since you're watching my videos, that you are someone who also struggles with some mental health issues. And as a result, I'm sure that you are someone who also struggles with automatic thinking and the, what do I want to call it? The absolute fucking bummer of your brain not being your friend sometimes. So if I pick apart that automatic thought that someone I know and love is dead, what I'm going to find in there is a bunch of what we call cognitive distortions. If you've ever taken a philosophy class or a class about logic, then you have heard these referred to as logical fallacies. The words are different because when you're talking about logical fallacies, you use bigger, cooler words. In my world, I get to use shorter, more concise terms to refer to all these things, but it's essentially the same thing. It is important to know that we are all guilty of cognitive distortions. Our brains are not always on our side. We develop these cognitive distortions as a way to protect ourselves. If you are someone who likes to be prepared for the worst case scenario, then you're going to find that you have a lot of the cognitive distortions that have to do with being hyper-focused on negative outcomes. If you are someone who really struggles with your self-esteem, then you're going to find that your brain uses a lot of cognitive distortions to maintain that low self-esteem. Why our brain loves to keep us locked in our own dark boxes of bullshit and sadness is still kind of beyond me. But in general, the human brain functions to maintain comfort and homeostasis. So wherever you have established that, that is where it's going to try and stay. As we've discussed before, the human brain is lazy and not always on our side. And cognitive distortions are just another fun and delightful way that our brains keep us from progressing in the way that we would like to progress. So I couldn't remember if I have ever said this to you guys in a video, but I say it like 3 or 4 times a day, so I'm assuming that I have. But I believe that no matter what mental health issue you are struggling with, in general, the best way for you to figure out how to deal with that is to become an expert on your own brain. If you are intimately familiar with the mechanisms that your brain uses and how those impact you and what those do to you cognitively and emotionally and behaviorally, it becomes much, much easier to catch those cycles in the process and either stop them or adjust them to be more helpful to you. So this is actually our first 2-part video. Usually I just kind of like, package it all up into one, but for your sake, I'm going to split this into 2. So today we're going to talk about what cognitive distortions are. We're going to run through the whole recognized list of the defined cognitive distortions that I look for in therapy, what they are, how they present, and then I'm going to encourage you to take the next 2 weeks to pay attention to your own thinking and look for which one of those cognitive distortions you are experiencing the most and where they tend to pop up, and trying to figure out if there are particular emotional states or situations in which they are more likely to be triggered. And then, just let me say though that I know that you're gonna hate that I split it this way, but I promise it's better. In 2 weeks, when another video comes out, in that video, we're gonna talk about what to do with your cognitive distortions. As per usual, I'm going to leave you stuck in your own terrible feelings for a couple of weeks. And I'm sorry, but if you don't take time to really get acquainted with how those cognitive distortions work in your brain in particular, it's gonna be a lot harder to challenge them and make changes to the way that you think about things. So stick with me today, learn all about all the ways that your brain can be a total dick to you. Come back in 2 weeks and I will help you figure out how to get your brain more on your side, and how to better deal with those automatic thoughts and cognitive distortions that make your life harder. So I played around with a lot of different ways to do this, but because of who I am as a person, some of them got pretty high concept and ridiculous, and just seemed pretty unnecessary. So I'm just gonna run down this list with you, and then you will have all of that information at your disposal, and we will go from there, okay? So cognitive distortion number 1 is what we call mind reading. And I need to differentiate real quick here. I don't think I've talked about this yet, but at some point we are absolutely going to talk about the concept of mind mapping. And on the surface, mind reading and mind mapping can look really similar, but they're not. So mind mapping is when you know someone so well that you can kind of predict how their brain works and what choices they will make and what they're trying to achieve with the behaviors that they have. So for instance, I know that because my counter at my house is still full of dirty dishes, that my boyfriend has initiated a standoff to see which one of us will clean it first. I know that's what he's doing. That's not a guess. So that's mind mapping, and everyone does that in every relationship all the time, always. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with it as long as you are using it for good and not for evil. Mind reading, on the other hand, is when you are making assumptions about the thoughts that other people have with no basis in fact or experience to make those sorts of determinations. So for example, I have a client that I see who is fully convinced that my receptionist hates him. And I know my receptionist very well. She's one of the kindest people in the entire world. And while I know that I do have some clients who irritate her, I also know that this person is not one of them. But no amount of me saying like, yeah, she doesn't hate you, like it's fine. Sometimes she's a little distracted, so maybe she's being a little short with you or something. I know that she doesn't hate you. This client will not believe me. This conversation that we have literally every time they come in goes nowhere because he is convinced that that is what she thinks and what she feels and what she believes. So that's mind reading. It is making really intense assumptions about other people's thoughts and opinions. We all probably do this to some extent. Like, I don't know if you've ever like been to a restaurant and your waitress has been kind of rude and you're like, well, she just hates me. Okay, so that is one possibility. Equally possible, you know, she's having a bad day, she's tired, she doesn't feel good, she just got yelled at by another customer, her feet hurt, this job is hard, she's not getting paid very much, she's tired. Like, I could go on and on. There are lots and lots of reasons why this person that you don't know may be giving you some negative feedback, and probably it has nothing to do with you. So it's mind reading. I see this one quite a bit, and like I said, I think most of us struggle with that. Cognitive distortion number 2 is fortune telling, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is predicting the future. So I might suggest to a client that they go try something new, go to a group therapy session or something like that because I think it'll be helpful for them. And they'll say, no, I already know it's gonna be bad, no one's gonna like me, I'm not gonna find any support. Okay, well, you don't know that. You're guessing. You are trying to tell the future, and that's not a skill that most of us have. If you do, shoot me an email because I have some questions about some stuff that's coming up in my life, and it wouldn't hurt to have some concrete answers. But if you are just a person like all the other people, you can't see the future. Sometimes your brain likes to pretend that it can because it thinks that it is protecting you and keeping you safe from a dangerous world. but it doesn't actually know. So fortune telling, like mind reading, is making decisions and assumptions without any actual data to support them. Number 3 is catastrophizing, and this is one that I am most certainly incredibly guilty of. For instance, when I hear sirens and think people are dead. That is catastrophizing. It is looking for the absolute worst case scenario, and then on top of that, your brain generates thoughts about how you will be unable to handle whatever terrible thing happens. So you're basically looking at every scenario, seeing the literal worst possible outcome of it, and then fixating on all the ways that that will destabilize you. So, this terrible thing is going to happen. That's fortune telling. And then you catastrophize that by saying, I won't be able to take it if that happens. I won't be able to stand it if I lose my partner. I won't be able to live if I lose my job. I won't be able to deal with myself if I fail this test. All of that is catastrophizing. And it's something that's pretty common too. I see this in a lot of patients, particularly those who have dealt with a lot of depression for a lot of time. You get used to things being awful and having a hard time coping with that awful. And so you expect awful and that you will be unable to deal with the awful when it arrives. I want to say we're on number 4, but I'm going to be honest, I lost count. Anyway, the next one is what's called labeling. And labeling is the one that I probably obsess about the most when I'm in session with people. And I don't really know why. It's not like it's like the worst one or anything, but it's one that just triggers a lot of thought processes for me. So labeling is when you take small aspects of someone's words or choices or behavior and generalize that into their qualities as a person. So what I see most commonly with labeling is that people will screw something up in their life. They'll fail at something, which is, a thing that we as humans are, prone to doing. And instead of saying, I failed this test, or I didn't get that job, or, my relationship didn't work out, what they say instead is, I'm a failure. I'm unemployable. I'm bad at relationships. They take these qualities and make them their definition. So labeling is commonly referred to when you're talking about logical fallacies as essentialism. So it's the idea that rather than being an aspect of someone's behavior and outward expressions, it is an essential quality that they hold. I think probably the danger of that is very obvious. If you can't allow yourself to fail without feeling that you are a failure, it becomes very difficult to try new things because you're a failure, so why bother? It sets you up for a false dichotomy, and it sets you up for not having a lot of space to try new things or experiment because you're convinced that whatever the outcome of your efforts is a definition of who you are as a person. Next is discounting positives. If you will remember, many, many weeks ago, we did a video where I talked about shape sorters, those like little kid toys where you put the star in the star hole and the square in the square hole. If you don't remember that metaphor, take a journey back through my videos and find it because I don't want to have to re-explain it. Discounting positives is when you've become so fixated on your negative viewpoint that you're unwilling to consider alternatives. So a good example of that is, if a client comes to me and says, I'm a terrible friend. And I say, well, why are you a terrible friend? And they say, well, I completely forgot that it was my friend's birthday. I'm a terrible friend. And then if I say, okay, so you made a mistake there, but do you remember 2 weeks ago you told me about how you had, taken her out to dinner and you guys had a really good time and you were able to really support her through some difficulties? That sounds like being a pretty good friend. Discounting positives would be if you responded to my statement by saying, well, that didn't even matter. That's just what people do. This is proof that I'm a terrible friend. So it's taking these little nuggets of information that prove something good, just tossing them out because they don't confirm your current view that you are a garbage person. Okay, so the next one is negative filter, which in my notes here I described as everything's a bummer. Not my most eloquent description, but I think it's pretty accurate. So I think a lot of the time, discounting positives as a cognitive distortion functions to create space for a negative filter. If I'm showing you positive examples, you need to get rid of those so that you can continue to see things as negative. When you are quite depressed, you get very mired in that negative view, and it's very hard to move past it, and you don't want to accept things that are different from that. So you just kind of dig in deeper to that, and that's where the negative filter comes in. The good parts don't matter. All that matters is what is terrible. Overgeneralization is the next one. Overgeneralization is not significantly different from labeling. Again, we're talking about taking small pieces of information and extrapolating them broadly, but in overgeneralization, we're talking more like, I've had a lot of clients that I've worked with who are dating will, in between sessions, go on a couple of dates and maybe things don't work out or something bad happens or whatever. And they come in, and when I say, how are things going? They go, well, all men are trash. Or women are all crazy. I'm like, okay. Or you met a crazy woman, and that was probably pretty rough. But I don't think it's fair to apply that label to like 4 billion people. So overgeneralization is taking small nuggets of information and applying them across very broad categories in ways that is neither accurate nor helpful. So again, similar to labeling, but in a slightly different context. Next is dichotomous thinking. More commonly, I call that all or nothing thinking or black and white thinking. Things either are or they are not. This is actually the reason why I hated math when I was in school, because there is a right answer, and that's it. I don't like functioning in that black and white system. I need to have room to talk my way around shit and kind of make it seem like I know more than I do. You've watched my videos, you know this is how I am. I'm great at it. So dichotomous thinking is difficult for people because when you don't create any gray area for yourself, the stakes for everything become very, very high. If you see things in terms of success or failure, then there is like a razor's edge between the two, and it could tip one way or the other. So it creates a sense of immediacy and a sense of importance because you're not giving yourself any wiggle room there. Shoulds is the next cognitive distortion. If you remember a while back, I made a video about tolerating discomfort, and in it I talked at length about radical acceptance, which is the practice of really focusing on and accepting what is. So shoulds is a cognitive distortion that is the opposite of radical acceptance. You fixate on how things should be or what it ought to be or how things should work instead of just accepting reality for what it is. The next one is personalizing. Again, if you will look back in time where I talk about my road rage issues, that is an example of my brain cognitively distorting and personalizing issues. So I made other people's behavior about me. Personalizing is taking a lot of blame for things, and it is, I don't know how else to describe it, but this description is going to sound a way that I don't want it to sound, so just like bear with me for a minute. But personalizing is essentially like exaggerating your own importance. And I don't mean like you're being a dick if you're personalizing, because it's an automatic brain function and it's not your fault. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is when you are personalizing, you are viewing yourself as the center of things that you are not at the center of. And so things feel like they are your fault, or people's behavior feels like it's about you, and it prevents you from looking at things in a broader context and being willing to consider alternatives. Blaming is the next one. This is essentially the opposite of personalizing. Instead of blaming yourself for everything, you're blaming everyone else for everything. I will say as a therapist, this is probably my biggest frustration because it's very difficult to work with clients who are unable to take any personal accountability for the situations in their life. So with blaming, you are making your thoughts, feelings, and actions other people's fault. I only did this because she did that. I only feel this way because of his choices, things like that. And on the surface, blaming exists in a gray area because sometimes things really are other people's fault. Sometimes they are not, and we're maybe just trying to shift blame from ourselves so that we don't have to deal with that responsibility. The next one is unfair comparisons, which is exactly what it sounds like. So I looked up the number for the sake of this example, and it honestly hurt my feelings. But Lindsay Ellis is a YouTuber who makes amazing video essays about movies. Lindsay Ellis has 860,000 subscribers. If you've been to my channel lately, you realize that my number is much smaller. And so for a moment there, when I think about it, I feel terrible and wonder why I'm even bothering. And then I remember that Lindsay Ellis has been doing this for a lot of years, and I've been doing it for like a few months. Not a super fair comparison, but also like if you haven't subscribed already, it'd be like super cool if you would, because it makes me feel good. Another example, you know, like if you pick up a guitar today and then next week you're like, well, I'm not Jimi Hendrix, so what's the point? So unfair comparisons are just not properly contextualizing your comparisons and holding yourself to unreasonable standards as a result. The next one is called regret orientation. Again, this is exactly what it sounds like. You are fixated on what you could have or should have done differently in the past and have a very hard time moving past that. I was going to come up with an example, but do I really need one? Who doesn't occasionally sit around for a few minutes and be like, God, I wish I hadn't screwed that one up? It's a pretty common human experience. Next is what ifs. I actually tend to refer to this as a yeah, but, because I have a lot of clients who I will make suggestions to them of things they could try or conversations they could have with important people to kind of start making changes in their life. And the response I get is, yeah, but what if? And then they start looking for a million reasons why whatever I've just said is pointless and won't work. So with what ifs, you are kind of miring yourself in the belief that it doesn't matter what you do, it's still going to turn out poorly. So the next one is emotional reasoning. This is also a thing that we have talked about in the past, but emotional reasoning is making all of your choices based on how you feel. If you will remember at the end of my Joker video, I read a tweet from Dan Harmon where he talks about how feelings are not facts. And this is very similar. You can feel like everything is on fire. That doesn't mean that everything is on fire. You can feel like you're worthless. That doesn't mean that you are worthless. But if you take your emotions and use them to guide your logic and decision making, you're gonna have a bad time. So that's emotional reasoning. And then inability to disconfirm, which to me is an unreasonably convoluted way to describe this, but that is what it's called, so whatever. Inability to disconfirm, which is basically just like rejecting evidence to refute your negative thoughts. So if you tell me that your boyfriend's definitely gonna break up with you, and I say like, well, I mean, he just took you out on a nice date or just bought you a nice gift, or he told you a few weeks ago that he really thought he could spend the rest of his life with you, and you just kind of throw all that out and stay focused on the idea that he's going to break up with you soon. So it falls in line with a lot of other cognitive distortions, as you can probably see, but it's just refusing to look at alternative solutions or outcomes. And then there is judgment focus, and this is very similar to dichotomous thinking. Everything kind of falls into these black and white categories of good or bad. You're not able to look at things and notice or describe them without applying some sort of value judgment. So I'm only able to experience anything in terms of whether or not it is good or bad. I'm not able to describe, the flavor of a particular meal that I ate without just saying, yeah, it was good, or no, it was very bad. It's basically an inability to use nuance to experience things. It just straight up comes down to the value judgment, and black and white thinking in general is not very helpful. So this is just another version of that, more or less. So there you go, guys. 17 cognitive distortions. So it is important that you know that it takes a long time to get good at noticing and managing your own cognitive distortions. Our thoughts occur without much intentionality from us. So it's going to be difficult to pay attention all of the time to what goes on in your brain. So here's what I am suggesting. For the next 2 weeks, be super nice to yourself while you do this, and just notice when you catch yourself exhibiting some of these cognitive distortions. I recommend that you write down which ones they are, because otherwise you are going to forget. And so in a couple weeks when I make another video and I'm like, hey, here's how you solve all of these, you're gonna be like, shit, which one do I need? So take notes, pay attention, be kind and patient with yourself. And then in a couple of weeks, we will talk about how you can start working through some of those cognitive distortions. All right, that's it, kids. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate you as always. Please like and share and subscribe and tell your friends and have them like and share and subscribe and, I don't know, help me out here. If you have comments or thoughts or opinions or ideas, you can leave them in the comments below. You can shoot me an email. You can find me on Twitter. Twitter's great, by the way. So if you don't follow me on Twitter, then you don't know that I have been asking for people who have a current or previous diagnosis of borderline personality disorder to please email me because I have some questions I would like to ask you. I am like halfway through an idea for a video about borderline personality disorder, but I want some more input from human beings with that disorder before I just start talking about it. So if that applies to you, please get in touch with me. The information is there. Thank you so much, guys. I will see you next time.